What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
You've been stealing from our dying mother for months. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering years of trust and family bonds in an instant. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of devastating betrayal, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we go on, consider subscribing to the channel to be notified as new stories are published. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach. Ruth Wilson had always been the responsible one. At 61, she had the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of caring for others, first her own children, then her aging parents, and now, in what should have been her golden years, her 85-year-old mother, Florence. The small ranch-style house on Maple Street had been Ruth's childhood home, and now it had become both sanctuary and prison as she navigated the heartbreaking journey of her mother's declining health. Florence Wilson had once been the neighborhood's unofficial mayor, the woman who organized block parties, remembered everyone's birthdays, and could bake a casserole that solved any crisis. But dementia had slowly stolen pieces of her away, leaving behind fragments of the vibrant woman she used to be. Some days were better than others. Some days, Florence would smile and call Ruth by name, asking about her grandchildren with genuine interest. Other days, she would stare at Ruth with confusion, asking when her daughter was coming to visit. Ruth had moved in with her mother 18 months ago, after Florence had been found wandering the neighborhood at 3 a.m, wearing only her nightgown and slippers, looking for her long-deceased husband. The decision hadn't been easy. Ruth had her own small apartment across town, a part-time job at the local library, and dreams of maybe traveling a little now that her son Kevin was grown and settled. But when your mother needs you, Ruth believed, you step up. That's what family does. The daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise. Ruth would wake at 6:30 to help Florence with her medications, a rainbow array of pills for blood pressure, heart conditions, and the supplements her doctor hoped might slow the memory loss. Breakfast was usually oatmeal or scrambled eggs, something soft and familiar. Then came the careful negotiation of getting Florence dressed, which could take anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on her mother's mood and clarity that particular morning. "I can dress myself, Ruth," Florence would often insist, her voice carrying the authority she'd once wielded as a high school principal. "I've been dressing myself for 85 years. "I know, Mom," Ruth would reply gently, holding up 2 blouses. "I just thought you might like to choose between these today." The afternoons were filled with small activities, looking through old photo albums, watching classic movies, or sitting on the front porch where Florence could wave at neighbors and feel connected to the world beyond their front door. Mrs. Patterson, the 78-year-old widow next door, had become an invaluable ally in these daily routines. She would often stop by with fresh flowers from her garden or homemade cookies, and her presence seemed to calm Florence in ways that even Ruth couldn't achieve. "Your mother and I have been neighbors for 43 years, Mrs. Patterson had told Ruth one afternoon as they watched Florence doze in her favorite chair. "I remember when you and your sister were just little girls, running through the sprinklers in the front yard. Your mother was so proud of both of you." Diane, Ruth's younger sister by 3 years, though you'd never know it from looking at them. While Ruth's brown hair had gone silver and her face showed the stress lines of constant caregiving, Diane maintained the polished appearance of someone who had time for salon appointments and spa days. She taught 4th grade at the elementary school across town and lived in a tidy townhouse with her cat, Whiskers. Her teacher's salary of $50,000 a year, combined with her careful budgeting, had always allowed her to live comfortably if modestly. She had never married, never had children, and had always seemed to Ruth to live a charmed, uncomplicated life. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Diane would arrive at their mother's house with a bright smile and a cheerful attitude that Ruth sometimes envied. She would breeze through the front door with bags from the grocery store or the pharmacy, kiss Florence on the cheek, and immediately begin organizing whatever needed attention. "How are we doing this week?" Diane would ask, though the question always seemed directed more at the house than at Ruth herself. "I picked up Mom's prescriptions, and I grabbed some of those crackers she likes. Oh, and I stopped by the bank to check on things." This last part had become a regular feature of Diane's visits over the past year and a half. When Florence's condition had worsened and the financial responsibilities had become more complex, Diane had volunteered to take over managing their mother's accounts. Ruth had been grateful for the help. She had never been particularly good with numbers, and the stress of caregiving left little mental energy for dealing with insurance claims, pension payments, and medical bills. "You have enough on your plate," Diane had said when she first offered. "I deal with budgets and paperwork at school all the time. Let me handle the money stuff so you can focus on taking care of Mom." It had seemed like a blessing. Ruth trusted her sister completely. They were family after all, and Diane had always been responsible with money. She lived modestly, drove a sensible car, and had always been the one to calculate the check when they went out to dinner together. If anyone could navigate the maze of Florence's financial needs, it would be Diane. But lately, small things had begun to worry Ruth. Last month, when she had gone to pick up Florence's heart medication, the pharmacist had informed her that the prescription insurance had lapsed. Ruth had stood at the counter, embarrassed and confused, while other customers waited behind her. "There must be some mistake," she had told the young pharmacist. "My sister handles all the insurance paperwork." "The system shows the last payment was 2 months ago," the pharmacist had replied kindly. "Sometimes these things get overlooked. You can pay out of pocket today and sort it out with the insurance company later." $47. Ruth had paid it from her own limited savings, making a mental note to ask Diane about it later. But when Sunday came, Diane had brushed off the concern with a wave of her hand. "Oh, that's just a computer glitch," she had said, not looking up from the stack of mail she was sorting. "I'll call them tomorrow and get it straightened out." You know how these insurance companies are, they're always making mistakes. Ruth had accepted the explanation because she wanted to believe it. The alternative, that there might be real financial problems, was too frightening to contemplate. Florence's pension and Social Security benefits should have been more than enough to cover her medications and basic living expenses. Ruth contributed what she could from her small savings, but she had assumed that the bulk of her mother's care was covered by Florence's own income. Then there had been the incident with the grocery delivery. Ruth had been expecting the weekly grocery order that Diane always arranged, but when Thursday came and went without any delivery, Ruth had called the store directly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that account has been suspended due to non-payment," the customer service representative had told her. The last payment was returned by the bank 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. Ruth had felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had called Diane immediately, but her sister's phone had gone straight to voicemail. When Diane finally called back that evening, she had sounded irritated rather than concerned. "Ruth, you're worrying about nothing," Diane had said, her voice sharp with impatience. "I've been juggling a lot of different accounts and payment schedules. Sometimes wires get crossed. I'll take care of it tomorrow." "But Diane, if Mom's accounts are having problems..." "They're not having problems," Diane had interrupted. "I'm handling everything, okay? You don't need to stress about this stuff. That's why I'm taking care of it." The conversation had left Ruth feeling uneasy, but also guilty for questioning her sister's competence. Diane was doing her a favor by managing the finances, after all. The least Ruth could do was trust her to handle it properly. But the incidents kept accumulating like small pebbles in Ruth's shoe, individually minor, but collectively impossible to ignore. The missed payment for Florence's medical alert bracelet. The notice from the utility company about a past-due electric bill. The awkward conversation with Dr. Martinez's office about an outstanding balance for Florence's last checkup. Each time, Diane had an explanation. Computer errors, postal delays, bureaucratic incompetence. And each time, Ruth had wanted to believe her sister because the alternative was unthinkable. It was Mrs. Patterson who first voiced what Ruth had been trying not to think. They were sitting on Florence's front porch on a warm Tuesday afternoon, watching Florence nap in her chair and enjoying the late September sunshine. Mrs. Patterson had brought over a fresh batch of her famous oatmeal cookies, and they were sharing a pot of coffee while keeping a gentle eye on Florence. "Ruth, dear," Mrs. Patterson had said carefully, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with your family's finances?" Ruth had felt her cheeks flush. "Why would you ask that?" "Well, it's just that I couldn't help but notice your sister's been driving a different car lately." Mrs. Patterson's voice was kind but concerned. "I saw her last weekend in a very nice red convertible, very sporty. I just thought it was unusual since she's always driven that little blue sedan." Ruth's stomach had dropped. "A different car?" Ruth had tried to process this information. A new car? Diane hadn't mentioned anything about buying a new car. Even on a teacher's salary of $50,000 a year, a red convertible seemed like an unusual purchase for someone as typically frugal as Diane. "Maybe she got a raise at school," Ruth had said weakly, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they didn't make sense. Teachers' salaries were public information, and raises were never substantial enough to support a luxury car purchase. Maybe Mrs. Patterson had agreed, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it any more than Ruth did. That night, Ruth had lain awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with uncomfortable possibilities. She had tried to remember the last time she had actually seen any of Florence's financial statements. Diane always handled the mail, always took the bank statements with her when she left on Sundays, always insisted that Ruth didn't need to worry about boring paperwork. When had Ruth stopped asking to see the statements? When had she become so completely dependent on Diane's word about their mother's financial situation? The realization made her feel naive and foolish, but also frightened. If something was wrong, really wrong, how would she even know? The following Sunday, Ruth had decided to ask more pointed questions. She had waited until Florence was napping and Diane was sorting through the weekly mail pile at the kitchen table. "Diane," Ruth had started carefully, "I've been thinking that maybe I should start looking at Mom's bank statements again. You know, just to stay informed about how she's doing financially." Diane's hands had stilled on the envelopes she was sorting. "Why? Is there a problem?" "No problem," Ruth had said quickly. "I just feel like I should be more involved. It's not fair to put everything on you." "Ruth, we've been through this." Diane's voice had taken on a patient, slightly condescending tone that Ruth remembered from their childhood. "You're already doing the hard work of taking care of Mom day in and day out. The least I can do is handle the boring financial stuff. Besides, you've never been good with numbers." The dismissal had stung, partly because it was true. Ruth had always struggled with math, had always been happy to let others handle complex financial matters. But this felt different. This was her mother's money, her mother's security. "I know I'm not great with numbers," Ruth had persisted, "but maybe you could just show me the basics? Like how much is coming in each month, how much is going out for expenses. I worry sometimes about whether we're spending too much on her care." Diane had gathered the mail into a neat stack and stood up from the table. "Ruth, I promise you everything is fine. Mom's pension and Social Security are more than enough to cover her expenses. If there were any problems, don't you think I would tell you?" Would she? Ruth had found herself wondering. Would Diane tell her if there were problems? Or would she try to handle them herself, the way she had always tried to handle everything in their family? After Diane left that afternoon, Ruth had sat in the quiet kitchen, feeling more unsettled than ever. She had tried to calculate in her head what Florence's monthly income should be, her teacher's pension, her social security, the small annuity from their father's life insurance. Even with her poor math skills, Ruth was fairly certain the total should be enough to cover Florence's medications, groceries, utilities, and other basic expenses with money left over. So where was that extra money going? Ruth had been mulling over these questions for several days when her son Kevin called. At 32, Kevin was a software engineer with an analytical mind and a protective streak when it came to his family. He lived about an hour away with his wife Amanda, and he made a point of visiting his grandmother at least twice a month. "Hi, Mom," Kevin had said when Ruth answered the phone. "How's Grandma doing this week?" "She's having a pretty good week," Ruth had replied. "She remembered your name yesterday and asked when you were coming to visit next." "That's great. Actually, I was thinking about driving over this weekend. Amanda's going to her sister's bridal shower, so I'll have some free time. Maybe I could help you with some of those household projects you mentioned." Ruth had felt a surge of gratitude. Kevin was always looking for ways to help, whether it was fixing a leaky faucet or just spending time with Florence so Ruth could run errands without worry. "That would be wonderful," Ruth had said. "Actually, Kevin, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Ruth had hesitated, unsure how to voice her growing concerns without sounding paranoid or disloyal to Diane. "Do you think? Have you noticed anything unusual about your Aunt Diane lately?" There had been a pause on the other end of the line. "Unusual, how?" "I don't know exactly. She just seems different. More secretive about Mom's finances. And Mrs. Patterson mentioned seeing her with expensive purchases, which seems odd if money is tight." Kevin had been quiet for a long moment. "Mom, would you be okay with me taking a look at Grandma's financial situation? I don't want to step on Aunt Diane's toes, but if you're worried, maybe it would be good to have a second set of eyes on things." "You think that's appropriate?" "I think you're Grandma's primary caregiver, and you have every right to understand her financial situation, especially if you're contributing your own money to her care." Ruth had felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone else to validate her concerns, to tell her that her worries weren't silly or unfounded. "What would you need to do that?" she had asked. "Well, ideally I'd need access to her bank statements and account information. Do you know what bank she uses?" Ruth had closed her eyes, embarrassed by her own ignorance. "I think it's First National, where she's banked for years. But Diane handles all of that now." "Okay, well, maybe we can figure out a way to get that information. Don't worry, Mom. We'll get to the bottom of this." After hanging up, Ruth had felt both relieved and anxious. She was grateful to have Kevin's support, but she was also frightened about what they might discover. Part of her still hoped that Diane's explanations were true, that all the financial irregularities were just innocent mistakes or administrative errors. But a growing part of her feared that the truth might be much worse than she had imagined. When Saturday arrived, Kevin had shown up at Florence's house with a toolbox and a laptop bag, ready to tackle both household repairs and financial investigation. He had spent the morning fixing a squeaky door and replacing some burnt-out light bulbs while chatting easily with Florence, who seemed delighted by the attention from her grandson. "Kevin, did I tell you about the time your mother fell into Miller's Pond when she was 7? Florence had asked, her eyes bright with the memory. "Only about 100 times, Grandma," Kevin had replied with a grin, "but I never get tired of hearing it." After lunch, when Florence was settled in her chair for her afternoon nap, Kevin had pulled out his laptop and turned to Ruth with a serious expression. "Okay, Mom, let's see what we can figure out about Grandma's finances. Do you have any account numbers or statements lying around?" Ruth had shaken her head. "Diane always takes everything with her when she leaves. She says it's safer that way, in case someone breaks in." Kevin had raised an eyebrow. "Someone's going to break in to steal bank statements?" "That's what I thought, but Diane said identity theft is a real concern for elderly people. It is, Kevin had agreed, but keeping statements locked away from the people who should have access to them isn't really a solution. Do you know if Grandma has online banking set up? I have no idea. She's never been very comfortable with computers. Kevin had nodded thoughtfully. Well, let's start with what we know. First National Bank, right? And we know her social security number? Ruth had provided the information she could remember, and Kevin had spent the next hour on the phone with various customer service representatives, explaining that he was trying to help his grandmother access her account information. It had been a frustrating process. The bank's security protocols were designed to prevent exactly this kind of inquiry, but Kevin's patience and technical knowledge had eventually paid off. Okay, he had said finally, hanging up the phone and turning to his laptop. I was able to get them to set up online access for Grandma's checking account. They're going to send a verification code to the phone number on file, which I assume is the house phone here? Ruth had nodded, her heart beating faster with anticipation and dread. When the verification code arrived, Kevin had quickly completed the setup process. Within minutes, Florence's bank account information was displayed on his laptop screen. Ruth had leaned over his shoulder to look, though the numbers and categories on the screen might as well have been written in a foreign language. Kevin, however, had gone very still as he scrolled through the account history. "Mom," he had said quietly, "you need to sit down." Ruth had felt her legs go weak. "What is it?" Kevin had turned the laptop toward her, pointing to a series of entries on the screen. "Look at these withdrawals. They started small about a year ago, a few hundred here and there. But look how they've escalated over the past several months. Now it's sometimes twice a week, always for larger amounts, $800, $1,200. Ruth had stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. What does that mean? It means someone has been taking money out of Grandma's account on a regular basis, and the amounts have been getting bigger over time. Kevin had scrolled up to show earlier entries. Look here, 18 months ago, before these withdrawals started, Grandma had over $30,000 in this account. Now she has less than $10,000. The room had seemed to spin around Ruth. $20,000? Mom, someone has stolen over $20,000 from Grandma over the past year and a half. Ruth had sunk into a chair, her mind reeling. But who would? How could someone? She had trailed off as the obvious answer hit her like a physical blow. There was only one person who had access to Florence's accounts, only one person who could have made those withdrawals without triggering any security alerts. Kevin had reached the same conclusion. Mom, I think we need to have a serious conversation with Aunt Diane. The next few hours had passed in a blur of phone calls and research. Kevin had helped Ruth access Florence's other accounts, her savings account, her retirement account, her small investment portfolio. The story was the same everywhere, regular, substantial withdrawals that had systematically drained Florence's life savings. She was so careful with money her whole life. Ruth had said, tears streaming down her face as they tallied up the losses. She worked 2 jobs to put me and Diane through college. She saved every penny for her retirement. Kevin had put his arm around his mother's shoulders. We're going to get this money back, Mom. This is elder financial abuse, and it's a serious crime. But first, we need proof that Aunt Diane is the one who's been making these withdrawals. They had spent the evening researching elder financial abuse laws and gathering documentation. Kevin had printed out bank statements, account histories, and withdrawal records. The pattern was undeniable. The systematic theft had begun small when Diane had taken over managing Florence's finances, but had escalated significantly over time. The question is, Kevin had said as they organized their evidence, do we confront her directly or do we go to the police first? Ruth had wrestled with this decision all night. Part of her still couldn't believe that her sister, her own sister, could have stolen from their dying mother. But the evidence was overwhelming and Ruth's responsibility was to Florence, not to Diane. I think we should give her a chance to explain, Ruth had finally decided. Maybe there's something we're not understanding. Kevin had looked skeptical. Mom, there's no innocent explanation for this. She's stolen over $20,000. I know, Ruth had said quietly. But she's still my sister. I want to hear what she has to say before we involve the police. They had agreed to confront Diane during her next Sunday visit. Kevin would hide in the spare bedroom with a recording device, while Ruth presented the evidence to Diane and tried to get her to admit what she had done. Sunday morning had arrived gray and drizzly, matching Ruth's mood as she prepared for the confrontation. Florence had seemed more confused than usual, asking repeatedly when her daughters were coming to visit and why everyone looked so serious. "They'll be here soon, Mom," Ruth had reassured her, though her stomach was churning with anxiety. Mrs. Patterson had stopped by mid-morning, ostensibly to drop off some fresh muffins, but clearly sensing that something was wrong. "You look troubled, dear," she had said, studying Ruth's face with concern. Ruth had found herself pouring out the whole story: the missing money, the evidence Kevin had uncovered, the confrontation she was planning. Mrs. Patterson had listened with growing anger and determination. "That girl," she had said, shaking her head. "I should have known something was wrong when I saw her with that expensive new car. Your poor mother worked so hard for that security." "Mrs. Patterson, would you mind staying here during our conversation with Diane?" Ruth had asked. "I could use the moral support, and if things get difficult, it might help to have a witness." "Of course, dear. I wouldn't dream of leaving you to handle this alone." When Diane's car had pulled into the driveway at her usual time, Ruth had felt her heart start racing. Kevin was positioned in the spare room with his phone set to record. Mrs. Patterson was sitting with Florence, ostensibly helping her work on a jigsaw puzzle, but actually providing silent support for what was about to unfold. Diane had entered the house with her typical cheerful energy, carrying her usual bags of groceries and supplies. She had kissed Florence on the cheek, greeted Mrs. Patterson politely, and started organizing items in the kitchen. "How's everyone doing this week?" she had asked, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. Ruth had taken a deep breath, her hands shaking as she pulled out the folder of bank statements Kevin had prepared. "Diane, we need to talk." Something in Ruth's tone had made Diane look up from the groceries she was unpacking. "Is everything okay?" "No," Ruth had said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Everything is not okay. I know what you've been doing." Diane's face had gone very still. "What are you talking about?" Ruth had opened the folder and pulled out the bank statements, spreading them across the kitchen table. "I'm talking about this. I'm talking about the $20,000 you've stolen from our mother over the past year and a half." For a moment, Diane had just stared at the papers on the table. Then she had laughed, a high, nervous sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Ruth, you're being ridiculous. I haven't stolen anything. I'm managing Mom's finances, just like we agreed." "Managing her finances?" Ruth's voice had risen. "Is that what you call it when you started by taking a few hundred here and there, then worked up to withdrawing over $1,000 a week from her checking account? When you drain her savings account to buy yourself a new car?" Diane's composure had started to crack. "You don't understand the complexities of managing someone's financial portfolio. There are investments, transfers between accounts." "Show me," Ruth had interrupted. "Show me these investments. Show me where this money went. I don't have to justify my financial management to you." Diane had snapped, her helpful demeanor finally dropping away. "You asked me to handle this because you couldn't do it yourself. You don't get to second-guess my decisions now." "My decisions?" Ruth had stood up from the table, her voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "These aren't your decisions to make. This is our mother's money, money she saved for her care, and you've been stealing it." "I haven't been stealing anything," Diane had shouted back. "I've been working my ass off to manage her care while you get to play the devoted daughter. Do you have any idea how much work it is to handle all the financial responsibilities?" Work that you're apparently being paid very well for, Mrs. Patterson had interjected quietly from across the room. Diane had whirled around to face the older woman. This is none of your business. It became my business when I watched you drive away in a brand new convertible while your sister worried about affording your mother's medications, Mrs. Patterson had replied calmly. The room had fallen silent except for the sound of Florence humming quietly to herself as she worked on her puzzle, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. Ruth had looked at her sister, really looked at her, and seen a stranger. The Diane she had grown up with, the sister she had trusted with their mother's life savings, was gone. In her place was someone Ruth didn't recognize. Someone capable of stealing from their own dying mother. How long? Ruth had asked quietly. How long have you been taking her money? Diane had crossed her arms defensively. I don't know what you're talking about. The bank records show it started over a year ago with small amounts. Ruth had pressed, but I'm guessing you were planning this even before that. How long, Diane? Diane's facade had finally crumbled completely. You don't understand, she had said, her voice breaking. I never meant for it to go this far. It started with just a few $100s here and there. I had some unexpected expenses, and I knew Mom had plenty of money just sitting there. Unexpected expenses like a new car? Like shopping sprees at the mall? I was going to pay it back, Diane had cried. I always planned to pay it back. With what money? Ruth had demanded. You're a teacher, Diane. You make $50,000 a year. How were you planning to pay back $20,000? Diane had started crying then, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. I don't know, she had whispered. I don't know. It just kept getting worse. Every time I took money, I told myself it would be the last time, but then there would be something else I needed or wanted, and Mom had so much. Had? Ruth had said quietly. She had so much. Now, when she needs expensive medical care or has to go into a nursing home, there will be much less money available because you spent it all on yourself. The truth of this statement had seemed to hit Diane like a physical blow. She had sunk into a chair, still crying, her hands covering her face. I'm sorry, she had whispered. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone. Ruth had felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, disappointment, grief for the sister she thought she knew, and underneath it all, a terrible sadness for their mother, who had worked so hard to ensure her own security in her final years. Sorry doesn't bring back $20,000, Ruth had said. It was then that Kevin had emerged from the spare room, his phone in his hand, his face grim with anger and disappointment. I got it all, he had said quietly. Her admission? Everything. Diane had looked up, startled to see her nephew. Kevin, what are you doing here? Protecting my grandmother, Kevin had replied. Which is apparently more than you were doing. The confrontation that followed had been painful and chaotic. Diane had alternated between tearful apologies and defensive anger, trying to justify her actions by claiming that she deserved compensation for all the work she had done managing Florence's care. She had accused Ruth of being ungrateful, had suggested that their mother would have wanted her to have the money anyway, had even tried to argue that she had been doing Ruth a favor by handling the financial responsibilities. None of it had held up under scrutiny. The bank records were clear, Kevin's recording was damning, and Diane's own admissions had sealed her fate. You've been stealing from our dying mother for months. Ruth had finally shouted, the words that would later echo in her memory as the moment when everything changed forever. The police had been called. Mrs. Patterson had quietly taken Florence to her own house while the officers interviewed everyone involved. Diane had been arrested for elder financial abuse, a felony that carried serious penalties including potential prison time. In the days that followed, Ruth had learned more about her sister's deception than she had ever wanted to know. The new car had been the most visible sign of the theft, but there had been other purchases as well. Home improvements to Diane's townhouse, expensive electronics, designer clothes. All of it had been paid for with Florence's money, taken gradually over more than a year through a pattern of escalating theft. The financial damage was extensive, but it wasn't irreparable. Kevin had worked with the bank and law enforcement to freeze Diane's accounts and recover what money remained. Florence's homeowner's insurance included coverage for financial crimes, which would help restore some of the stolen funds. The district attorney's office had assured Ruth that they would pursue full restitution as part of any plea agreement. But the emotional damage felt much deeper and more lasting. Ruth struggled with guilt over not recognizing the theft sooner, with anger at her sister's betrayal, and with grief over the loss of the family relationship she had treasured her whole life. It was Mrs. Patterson who had provided the wisdom and perspective Ruth needed to begin healing. "You trusted your sister because that's what families do," she had said one afternoon as they sat on Florence's porch, watching the older woman nap peacefully in her chair. "You're not naive or foolish for believing that someone you loved wouldn't hurt your mother. You're human." "But I should have been more careful," Ruth had protested. "I should have been watching the accounts myself." "Ruth, dear," Mrs. Patterson had said gently, "you were caring for your mother 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You were exhausted, overwhelmed, and grateful for help. Any reasonable person would have trusted their sister in that situation. I just keep thinking about all the signs I missed, the insurance lapses, the unpaid bills, the way she always took the statements with her." "Those weren't signs of your failure," Mrs. Patterson had replied firmly. "Those were signs of Diane's skill at deception. She knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to avoid detection. That's not your fault, that's hers." Kevin had been equally supportive, though his anger at his aunt ran much deeper than his mother's. "Mom, you need to stop blaming yourself for trusting family," he had said during one of their conversations about the case. "What Diane did was calculated and deliberate. She took advantage of your love and trust, and she exploited Grandma's vulnerability. That makes her the criminal, not you the victim." The legal proceedings had moved forward with surprising speed. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the bank records, Kevin's recording, her own admissions, Diane had accepted a plea agreement rather than go to trial. She had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, 5 years of probation, and full restitution of the stolen funds. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that crimes against elderly family members represented a particularly heinous breach of trust. "Mrs. Wilson trusted you with her life savings because you were her daughter," the judge had said, looking directly at Diane during the sentencing hearing. "She had every right to expect that trust to be honored. Instead, you systematically stole from her over many months, leaving her vulnerable and her primary caregiver struggling to afford basic necessities. Your actions represent not just theft, but a profound betrayal of the most sacred family bonds." Ruth had attended the sentencing hearing, though she had struggled with whether to go. Part of her still felt guilty about her sister's fate, even knowing that Diane had brought it on herself. But Mrs. Patterson had convinced her that witnessing the legal resolution was an important part of moving forward. "You need to see justice done," she had said. "Not for revenge, but for closure. Your mother deserves to know that her money and her trust were valued by the legal system, even if they weren't valued by her own daughter." The judge's words had indeed provided a sense of closure. Ruth had left the courthouse feeling that Florence's dignity had been restored, that the legal system had recognized the seriousness of what Diane had done. But the most meaningful part of the resolution had come in the weeks that followed, as Ruth began to rebuild her life and her support system without Diane's deceptive help. Mrs. Patterson had become more than just a neighbor. She had become a true friend and ally in caring for Florence. She had offered to help with daily care tasks, and her presence seemed to bring Florence genuine comfort and joy. "Your mother and I have so much history together," Mrs. Patterson had explained when Ruth had tried to protest that she was doing too much. "Taking care of her now feels like taking care of family. Besides, at my age, having a purpose and feeling needed is a gift." Kevin had also stepped up in ways that surprised and touched Ruth. He had started visiting twice a week instead of twice a month, and he had taken over all of Florence's financial management, setting up proper oversight and safeguards to prevent any future abuse. "I should have been doing this all along," he had told Ruth. "Grandma's family, and family takes care of each other. The real kind of taking care, not the kind Aunt Diane was doing." He had also helped Ruth access resources she hadn't known existed: support groups for families dealing with dementia, financial assistance programs for elderly care, and legal aid services for victims of elder abuse. The network of support had been overwhelming in the best possible way. The most surprising development had been Ruth's discovery of her own strength and capability. With proper support and clear information about Florence's financial situation, Ruth had found that she was much more capable of managing complex care decisions than she had ever given herself credit for. "I always thought I wasn't smart enough to handle the money stuff," she had confided to Mrs. Patterson one afternoon, "but it turns out I just needed the right information and the right support system." "Intelligence isn't about being good with numbers," Mrs. Patterson had replied. "Intelligence is about caring enough to ask the right questions and seek the right help." "You've always had that kind of intelligence, Ruth. Diane just convinced you that you didn't." The recovered money had made an enormous difference in Florence's quality of life. Ruth had been able to hire a part-time aide to help with daily care, which had given her some much-needed respite. They had also been able to afford better medical care, including visits from a geriatric specialist who had helped adjust Florence's medications to improve her comfort and clarity. Florence herself seemed somehow more peaceful in the months following Diane's arrest, though Ruth was never sure how much her mother understood about what had happened. On her clearer days, Florence would ask about Diane, and Ruth had developed a gentle way of explaining that Diane was away for a while, without going into painful details. "She made some mistakes, Mom," Ruth would say, "but you're safe now, and you're taken care of." "I always worried about that girl," Florence had said during one of these conversations, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "She was so smart, but she always seemed restless, like what she had was never quite enough." Ruth had considered this observation carefully. Florence's moments of clarity were becoming less frequent, but when they came, they often revealed an underlying wisdom that dementia couldn't touch. 6 months after Diane's sentencing, Ruth had received an unexpected letter from her sister. It had been forwarded through the victim's advocate at the district attorney's office, and Ruth had debated for several days whether to open it. The letter had been filled with apologies and explanations, but also with requests for Ruth to visit her in prison and pleas for forgiveness. Diane had written about her regret, about how prison had given her time to think about what she had done, about her plans to make amends when she was released. Ruth had read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. She wasn't ready to forgive Diane, and she wasn't sure she ever would be. The betrayal had been too deep, the damage too extensive, but she also wasn't ready to close the door completely on the possibility of some kind of relationship in the future. "Forgiveness isn't something you do for the other person," Mrs. Patterson had said when Ruth had shared the contents of the letter. "It's something you do for yourself, when you're ready. And you're not required to be ready on anyone else's timeline." "I just don't know how to move past the anger," Ruth had admitted. "Every time I think about how she looked me in the eye and lied, how she took advantage of Mom's confusion, I get so angry I can barely breathe." "That's natural," Mrs. Patterson had replied. "That anger is protecting you right now. It's reminding you not to trust easily, not to ignore red flags. When you don't need that protection anymore, the anger will fade on its own." As winter had turned to spring, Ruth had begun to find moments of genuine happiness again. Florence's condition had stabilized, and there were still days when she was alert and engaged, able to enjoy conversations and activities. The financial security that the recovered money provided had removed a constant source of stress, and the support system that Ruth had built around herself had made the daily challenges of caregiving much more manageable. One particularly warm afternoon in May, Ruth had been sitting on the front porch with Florence and Mrs. Patterson, watching Kevin and his wife Amanda plant flowers in Florence's front garden. Florence had been having one of her better days, and she had been directing the flower planting operation with the authority of someone who had maintained that garden for 40 years. "The roses need more space between them," Florence had called out to Kevin. "And make sure you plant the marigolds where they'll get morning sunday." "Yes, Grandma," Kevin had replied with a grin. "You're the boss." Ruth had watched this scene with a deep sense of contentment. Her mother was surrounded by people who loved her garden was being cared for, and her financial security had been restored. The betrayal by Diane would always be a painful part of their family's story, but it no longer defined their daily reality. "You know," Mrs. Patterson had said quietly, "I think your mother is happier now than she was when Diane was still coming around." Ruth had considered this observation. "What makes you think that?" "She seems more relaxed, less anxious. I think on some level she knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't articulate it. Now that the threat is gone, she can just focus on enjoying the people who truly care about her." That evening, after Kevin and Amanda had gone home and Mrs. Patterson had returned to her own house, Ruth had sat with Florence as her mother got ready for bed. It was one of their quieter rituals. Ruth would help Florence with her nighttime medications, and they would talk softly about the day. "Ruth," Florence had said as Ruth was helping her into her nightgown, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done for me." Ruth had felt tears spring to her eyes. These moments of clarity were becoming less frequent, and each one felt like a gift. "You don't need to thank me, Mom. You're my mother. This is what daughters do." "Not all daughters," Florence had replied with a sad smile. "I know what Diane did, Ruth. I may not remember everything clearly, but I know she hurt us, and I know you protected me." As Ruth had tucked her mother into bed that night, she had reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The betrayal by Diane had been devastating, but it had also revealed the strength of the relationships that truly mattered. Kevin's unwavering support, Mrs. Patterson's generous friendship, and her own capacity for resilience and growth, these were the treasures that had emerged from the wreckage of Diane's deception. 3 months later, on a bright Sunday morning in August, Ruth had been in the kitchen preparing Florence's breakfast when she had heard familiar voices from the front porch. Looking out the window, she had seen Mrs. Patterson sitting with Florence and Kevin setting up a small table with what appeared to be a birthday cake. Ruth had realized with a start that it was Florence's 86th birthday, a milestone she had been dreading because it would have been the first birthday celebration without Diane. But looking out at the small gathering on the porch, Ruth had felt only warmth and gratitude. She had joined them outside, where Kevin had produced a small chocolate cake with 86 candles, and Mrs. Patterson had brought a bouquet of flowers from her garden. "Make a wish, Grandma," Kevin had said, helping Florence lean forward toward the candles. Florence had closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them with a smile that seemed to encompass everyone on the porch. "I don't need to wish for anything," she had said clearly. "I have everything I need right here." Ruth had felt her heart swell with emotion as they had all sung Happy Birthday, as Florence had blown out her candles with help from Kevin, as Mrs. Patterson had served cake and told stories about the neighborhood's early days. This was what family looked like, Ruth had realized. Not the biological connections that could be corrupted by greed and selfishness, but the chosen connections built on love, loyalty, and genuine care for each other's well-being. As the afternoon had worn on and Florence had dozed peacefully in her chair, Ruth had found herself thinking about Diane's letter, still sitting in the drawer of her bedroom dresser. Maybe someday she would be ready to respond. Maybe someday there could be some form of reconciliation. But for now, Ruth was content to focus on the family she had built around herself and her mother, the family that had proven itself through action rather than just words. "Thank you," Ruth had said quietly to Mrs. Patterson and Kevin as they had cleaned up the birthday celebration, "for everything. For helping me see the truth, for supporting us through the legal process, for being here today." "Thank you for letting us be part of your family," Mrs. Patterson had replied. "Taking care of people we love, that's what makes life worth living." Kevin had hugged his mother tightly. "We're going to be okay, Mom. All of us. Grandma's safe, her money is secure, and she's surrounded by people who genuinely care about her. That's what matters." That night, as Ruth had helped Florence get ready for bed, her mother had surprised her with another moment of clarity. "Ruth, I need you to promise me something." "What is it, Mom?" "Promise me you won't let what Diane did make you afraid to trust people. There are good people in the world. People like Kevin, like Mrs. Patterson, like you. Don't let one person's bad choices poison your faith in everyone else." Ruth had felt tears rolling down her cheeks. "I promise, Mom." "Good," Florence had said with satisfaction, "because isolation is just another kind of prison, and we've had enough of prisons in this family." As Ruth had turned off the lights and settled into her own bed that night, she had felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. The betrayal by Diane would always be a painful part of their story, but it had also led to discoveries about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family that Ruth might never have found otherwise. Looking back on that confrontation in the kitchen, the moment when she had finally said, "You've been stealing from our dying mother for months," Ruth could see it now as not just an ending, but a beginning. The end of naive trust and willful blindness, but the beginning of a more honest, more secure, and ultimately more loving way of living. Florence was safe, surrounded by people who cherished her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. Ruth had discovered her own strength and capability. And their little chosen family had proven that love, when it's real and protective and honest, is stronger than betrayal. As she drifted off to sleep, Ruth could hear the gentle sounds of her mother's peaceful breathing from the next room, and Mrs. Patterson's porch light glowing through the window, a beacon of friendship and security in a world that had once seemed full of hidden threats. The story of Diane's betrayal was over. The story of their family's healing had just begun. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.